Hello, Joni Rotten back with another Rotten reading. This article is going to come to us from the American Journal of Psychiatry. This one says that there is devastating clinical consequences of child abuse and neglect, increased disease vulnerability, and poor treatment response in mood disorders. This was from 2019. The abstract says a large body of evidence has demonstrated that exposure to childhood maltreatment at any stage of development can have long-lasting consequences. It is associated with a marked increase in risk for psychiatric and medical disorders. This review summarizes the literature investigating the effects of childhood maltreatment on disease vulnerability for mood disorders, specifically summarizing cross-sectional and more recent longitudinal studies demonstrating that childhood maltreatment is more prevalent and is associated with increased risk for first mood episode reoccurrence, greater comorbidities, and increased risk for suicidal ideation and attempts in individuals with mood disorders. It summarizes that persistent alterations associated with childhood maltreatment, including alterations in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenaline axis and inflammatory cytokines, which may contribute to disease vulnerability and more pernicious disease course. The authors discuss several candidate genes for environmental factors, for example, substance abuse, that may alter disease vulnerability and illness course, and neurobiological associations that may mediate these relationships following childhood maltreatment. Studies provide insight into modifiable mechanisms and provide direction to improve both treatment and prevention strategies. A couple little quotes. It says, "It's not the bruises on the body that hurts. It's the wounds of the heart and the scars of the mind." And this one says, "We can deny our experience, but our body remembers." Oh, wow. I really like that one. That's great. It is now well established that childhood maltreatment or exposure to abuse and neglect in children under the age of 18 has devastating consequences. Over the past 2 decades, research has begun not only to define the consequences in the context of health and disease, but also to elucidate mechanisms underlining the link between childhood maltreatment and medical, including psychiatric outcomes. Research has begun to shed light on how childhood maltreatment mediates disease, risk, and course. Childhood maltreatment increases risk for developing psychiatric disorders, and some of the examples are mood and anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, antisocial and borderline personality disorders, and substance use disorders. It is associated with an earlier age at onset and more severe clinical course, the greater symptom severity, and poorer treatment response to pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy. Early life adversity is also associated with increased vulnerability to several major medical disorders, including coronary artery disease and myocardial infarction. Oh, we heard that one being used. Cerebral vascular, is that how you say that? Disease and stroke, type 2 diabetes, asthma, and certain forms of cancer. The net effect is a significant reduction in life expectancy in victims of child abuse and neglect. Oh, yay. The focus of this review is to expand on previous reviews by synthesizing the literature and integrating much recent data with a focus of investigating childhood maltreatment interactions with risks for mood disorder, disease onset, and early disease heterogeneity. Yeah, I do have it big. Just make sure that you can zoom in and see these big words as I struggle to read them. As well as emerging data suggesting modifiable mechanisms that could be targeted for early intervention and prevention strategies. I'm sure they include medicines. Is that your prevention strategy? A major emphasis of this review is to provide a clinically relevant update to practicing mental health practitioners. What's the prevalence? So it's got some charts here. The link between childhood maltreatment and risk for mood disorders and differences in disease course following illness onset have been well documented. There's sayings that if you're already here, you're going to end up here, right? You're going to end up here. Many studies have demonstrated greater risks of childhood maltreatment in patients with major depression and bipolar disorder. Indeed, a recent meta-analysis, again, a meta-analysis means they're going after all of the data that gets put in, seemingly anonymously, revealed that 46% of individuals with depression report childhood maltreatment. Patients with bipolar disorder also report high levels of childhood maltreatment, with estimates as high as 57%. Childhood maltreatment is associated with an increased risk and earlier onset of unipolar depression, with syndromal depression occurring on average 4 years earlier with individuals with a history of childhood maltreatment compared to those without. It's also associated with a more pernicious disease course, including a greater number of lifetime depressive episodes and greater depression severity, with the majority of studies showing more reoccurrence and greater depression. I think we know a lot of this, or we should, right? It's associated, what is, blah, 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 blah. Let's get down here. It also messes with your immune system. Are there, and these are the parts that I find so fascinating, as we're talking about developmental stages and things that are important to know about the developmental cycles of children, of ourselves. Stages. Timing of childhood maltreatment. Are there periods of heightened sensitivity? Although childhood maltreatment can at any age can result in long-lasting consequences, there is evidence that the timing, the duration, and the severity of maltreatment mediate the risk for later psychopathology. The timing, we talked about that. Well, why does this event or this activity happen when the majority of generations are at certain ages? Childhood maltreatment then occurs earlier in life and continues for longer, is associated with the worst. This is supported by, let's see, and then it goes into day 7, but not the later. So in one study, rodents found that maternal separation during the early postnatal period, 2 to 15 days, but not the later period, 7 to 20 days, is associated with anxious and depressive-like behaviors in adults. Although this postnatal period coincides with in utero development in human, there is evidence that in utero results in the forms of stress can have consequences similar to early life traumas, supporting the transitional validity of these models. Clinical studies also support the importance of timing of childhood maltreatment and moderating risks for psychopathology. They investigated the timing of duration of childhood maltreatment in 223 maltreated children between the ages of 3 and 9 and found that children who are maltreated during infancy and those who experience chronic maltreatment had poor inhibitory control and working memory. So in other words, I just learned that if I can give maltreatment between the ages of 3 and 9, I can create an outcome of poor inhibitory control and working memory. Thank you, science. I know exactly where to get them. I find these researchers or these articles very interesting. This is a long one. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I wanted to just kind of flip through it. You can see some of the titles for the chapters here, underlining mechanisms by which childhood maltreatment increases risk of mood disorders and contributes to disease course. There you can see the exposure, the disease vulnerability, the disease onset, and the disease course during this stage: birth, childhood, adolescence, and then it goes to young adult. Look at that. Genetics, epigenetics, neuroinflammation, HPA axis. It says the gray arrow, let me just read this in case you can see this. This is interesting. Represents the development of disease vulnerability, the disease onset, and the variations of disease course and treatment. Exposure to childhood maltreatment at any point during the development, that's the red bar, birth to adolescence, can result in long-lasting consequences, including increased disease vulnerability and illness. Severity in mood disorders. There may be optimal windows, the black arrows across the development, when interventions could decrease the disease burden by decreasing disease vulnerability and improving illness course. So at any point you can kind of, these little black arrows, these include before and after birth, such as parenting classes and parenting support groups at the time of maltreatment, when prodromal symptoms begin to emerge immediately following the disease onset and during disease course. And the green arrows and texts point to behavioral and environmental factors, as well as genetic and other molecular factors that could be focused on for interventions. There's the green arrows. Some biological abnormalities associated with a childhood maltreatment. Let's see, they're at a increased risk for mood and other disorders. It's associated with systematic inflammation, a C-reactive protein, and inflammatory cytokines, including tumor necrosis factor alpha and something else, interleukin 6. It can be associated with increased plasma CRP levels and increased body mass index. They also exhibit an increased levels of inflammatory markers. It's unclear whether childhood maltreatment associated inflammation is responsible for these observations in patients with mood disorders. And inflammatory drugs are a promising novel therapeutic strategy in the subgroup of depressed patients with elevated inflammation. Although the findings thus far are preliminary, and further study on inflammation is modifiable. In other words, we need more research. Another mechanism through which childhood maltreatment may increase for risk for mood disorders is through alterations of the HPA axis, the cortical corticotropin releasing factor. That's the CRF. Circuits that regulate endocrine, behavioral, immune, and autonomic responses to stress. It screws with you. Studies investigating the role of epigenetics, the modification of gene expression through DNA, methylation, and acetylation. Mediating detrimental outcomes following early life stress have recently appeared. Childhood maltreatment associated with epigenetics changes in individuals who died by suicide have been identified in the human postmortem studies. This is just scary. This just means that we need to really start paying attention to how we treat our kids. Taking them to the doctor might not be the best thing either. It's very traumatic when our kids are sick. It's very traumatic on their bodies. They don't even realize it. You think that they skate through, but their body can't tell the difference between a stubbed toe and a cold. Anyway, if you're interested in reading this paper, you may go look it up. Interesting to note these types of things down here. So let's see here. In summary, studies converge on and consistently report the findings that childhood maltreatment increases disease vulnerability for mood disorders as well as more. A reduction in the prevalence of childhood maltreatment would have a substantial impact on decreasing disease burden. In other words, if we prevented childhood maltreatment, we might not see as much diseases. So does that tell you? I'm just asking. If I was in the medical field and I was making medications for disease, mood disorders, and I find out that if I could remove childhood maltreatment, I wouldn't need to make these medicines. Do you think that I have any type of desire to start preventing childhood maltreatment? No, I don't. I have no motivation to do that. And I hear some of the examples being tossed out, like, that study we've talked about where, Gen Zers were asked, if having a camera in everyone's home prevented domestic violence, in other words, childhood maltreatment, would you be okay with that? And of course, yes, get rid of childhood maltreatment. I just feel like that. I'm all for it. I don't want to abuse children. Okay. But the people that are in charge of these types of ideas are businessmen. There's no business. There's no money in humans that are raised in happy, healthy homes. There's no textbook might be, a huge industry, but it's not as big as the pharmaceuticals. So I don't know exactly what we're going to do here, but I don't think that the ideas they have suggested so far sound like they're going to be any better. We'll start having, in another 30 years, we're going to start having all these studies come out that talk about the biological processes that happen when humans are monitored 24/7. Can you imagine a world where, like, everything that you do, it's as if maybe you don't get hurt. Maybe you don't. Maybe your smartwatch just says your vitamin D is low. You didn't get enough sun today. You only walked, 302 steps today. Could you imagine living in a home where every fucking thing you did and ate, said, thought, anytime you didn't pick up your room or left your sock in the hall, Every time you chose to eat a candy bar is, could you imagine living in a home like that? What kind of psychiatric problems do you think are going to come from that? You're constantly, consistently, every little thing you do wrong, you are told, even if you're not hit, even if nobody slaps you, but you're just consistently reminded that no matter how hard you try, you don't live up to my expectation of 303 steps a day. I don't know about you, but that sounds like it's going to create a whole other mess of problems. But let's just look to who we can send our correspondence to. Dr. Nemiroff. He's at Austin, Texas, University of Texas. He has served as a consultant for Bracket, which is Clintara, Fortress Biometric. He's a consultant for these companies. Remember what we're asking here. Fortress Biotech, what the hell? EMA Wellness, Gerson Lehrman Group, Intracellular Therapies, Janssen Research and Development, Magstem, Naviator Pharmaceuticals, Sunovion Pharmaceuticals, Tayasho Pharmaceuticals, Takeda, TCMSO, and Exhale. He holds stock in oh, for Pete's sake. AbbVie and Terra's, Biogen Holdings. I made myself laugh. I started coughing. I'm not supposed to laugh. Makes me cough. All these Corcept Therapeutics, pharmaceutical company. Oh, this one got two mentions. Excellent. Oh man. These are places this is where he holds stock. So that's who he is consulted for, but he also has stock there. OPKO Health, Seattle Genetics, TSMSO, Trends in Pharma Development, and Exhale. He is a member of the scientific advisory boards of the Anxiety Disorder Association of America, the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention, Bracket, and Brain and Behavioral Research Foundation, the Institute for Brain Research, Skyline Trail, Exhale, and on the board of directors at a few other places. He has an income source equity of $10,000 or more from American Psychiatric Publishing and all of these other places. He holds patents on a method of devices for transdermal delivery. And he's supported by a bunch of NIH grants. His research, Dr. Lippard's research, that's a different doctor. Nemiroff and research. These people have no motivation to making homes better for children or the world better for children. How could they? They're making money off of the children being sick by the world. What is going to motivate them to do anything different? And when we're sitting here and we're looking at some of the crazy stuff that's going on right now with all of these great doctors who seem to know all about what causes what, and we're allowing immigration, we're allowing poisonings, we're allowing sprayings, we're allowing food to be chemicals, gummies and candies, medicines and treatments. I don't know. I'm not seeing these great doctors coming up with any good ideas other than just more and more and more abuse. Right to the contrary. Anyway, there's an interesting little article. Have a good day.